My name is Professor David Harper from the University of Leicester. I'm a professor of limnology, which means simply water science, and by training I'm a zoologist, so you can perhaps call me a water biologist. I'm going to take you through this module on biodiversity, which has four main aims. The first one is to make you understand what biodiversity is, which is a relatively simple term. The second one is to help you understand why it's important. The third one is to understand why it is being destroyed. And of course that contributes to why it's important. And the fourth thing is to look at the various activities that we are trying to engage in to prevent biodiversity loss. So what is it? In simple terms, it means biological richness. Now, biological richness is a very general description. It applies to all of life on Earth, the richness of life on Earth. But we can break it down into perhaps four sub-topics, and those are in different scales. So if we go to the smallest scale first, we can call biodiversity the degree of genetic richness in a single species. So for example, the genetic richness of the common potato is very high in South America, where there are lots and lots of different varieties being grown by native farmers. But it's relatively low in an industrialized country like the United Kingdom, where there are a handful of potato varieties that a gardener can grow or that are commercially grown for sale and consumption. So the second level is the commonest level, that is to say the number of species, the species richness of a particular area like a nature reserve or a piece of an area like a county or a country. The third level is the number of populations of a species. If a species, for example, has a distribution that encompasses several countries like the whole of or the whole of Europe, then it's never going to be evenly distributed around that area, across that area. It's always going to be in discrete populations, and the number of populations of the species is important to its overall biodiversity. And the last level, in terms of a relatively simple understanding, is the diversity of communities. So if you imagine looking across from the top of a hill at a landscape, then the number of communities of pieces of mosaic in that landscape contributes to the diversity, the biological diversity of that landscape. So let's move on to the next topic, which is why biodiversity is important. Now, it's always been important to people, but it's not really been expressed very well. So if you think of the importance of biodiversity even just 1 or 2 generations ago, apart from its usefulness in the sense of using trees to cut and to use for making fences or making structure for buildings, its value was perceived by people to be something that was in the mind. The value of biodiversity for its beauty, for its variety, and for contributing inward peace to people on a walk or in a wild area. Now that kind of biodiversity, which we now call the cultural value of biodiversity, has only relatively recently been quantified in the sense of research which shows that people who live in cities are generally healthier if they have access to green spaces compared to only having access to walk around the streets. The value of biodiversity has become expressed more functionally in the last few decades, and perhaps the earliest usefulness of biodiversity is through tourism, which has developed largely after the Second World War through international tourism as well as national tourism. And if you think of wildlife in Africa that people pay thousands of pounds from Europe to go and see, that started with the creation of national parks, which in countries like South Africa or Eastern Africa started after the Second World War. But now, in the last decade or 2 decades, scientists have been making a much more comprehensive attempt to quantify the value of biodiversity in what was called ecosystem services. I expressed earlier one of them called the cultural ecosystem services, and I also used an example of timber, which is another value called provisioning ecosystem services. So everything in nature which gives us food, which gives us clothing, which gives us our houses around us, is called provisioning, are called provisioning ecosystem services. And then there is the value of nature in underpinning everything else. So for example, the oxygen that we breathe is kept at a constant percentage by the photosynthetic activities of the entire vegetation community of the globe, because oxygen is a waste product of photosynthesis. And so that is called regulating services. So this attempt to put a value on biodiversity is, as I said, relatively recent, and it's a response to the extent and the speed of which biodiversity is being lost, so that scientists or general people who are concerned about biodiversity loss can express it in terms of monetary value, which is perhaps more understandable by politicians who generally are not scientifically trained. So what do we actually mean by biodiversity loss? Now, if you think about biodiversity loss and what you might know about it before you've started any study of biodiversity, you might have heard of loss, extinction of species. So you might have heard of the dodo, a large flightless bird which went extinct in the 19th century because it was confined to relatively few islands. It was very, very easily caught by sailors, and they caught it and took it on board ships to use as food. They kept it alive to use as meat, and it very quickly got eliminated from the island that it was confined to. Now those losses of single species are well known, but biodiversity loss is much, much more than just loss of species into extinction. So it is local loss, and not just extinction, but loss in population abundance. So in the British Isles, for example, we have lost in terms of serious decline in abundance of common, or what used to be common, farmland birds. Birds which I as a child would see darkening the sky like lapwings are now extremely rare. And those losses can't be directly explained in a strict scientific sense, but in general they're caused by the intensification of agriculture, the loss of odd field corners which were rare, which were uncultivated, of wetlands, of food for these farmland birds in the form of insects which are generally less common because of pesticides, and the intensification, the switch from spring-sown cereals to winter-sown cereals, which means that there's much less habitat available for these birds. It can also mean loss of ecosystem types. So for example, in Britain and in most industrialised countries around the world, we have lost low nutrient ecosystems in water like lakes or rivers, because ubiquitously we have contaminated our environment with nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen. Phosphorus comes largely from human sewage, and nitrogen comes from farmland. So phosphorus and nitrogen are very, very common in drainage all over the countryside. There are only rare mountain areas that are low in phosphates and nitrates now. So largely we have lost lowland oligotrophic, as they're called, low nutrient lakes and rivers. And lastly, there's a loss in genetic diversity, and that's perhaps most apparent in crops because of industrial agriculture, but it's also apparent in species which are becoming more and more rare. So, for example, the cheetah, which is used to be widespread and very abundant over the whole of Africa, is now confined to relatively small populations that are isolated from each other in a few countries, like Kenya, like Tanzania, like South Africa, where there's savanna grasslands. But the cheetah has very, very low genetic diversity. So there's a risk of extinction because of unexpected features like diseases, which might wipe out a population that has little genetic resistance to a future disease. So in talking about examples of biodiversity loss, I've also given you some examples of what causes that biodiversity loss. But if we just look at the overall causes of biodiversity loss, by far the greatest is the change in land use which has happened as a consequence of population growth on the one hand and our increase in technology on the other. Now, population growth means that land is lost to urbanization, for example, but it also means that land is lost, natural ecosystems are lost to an increase in area of agricultural land, and the biodiversity that can share those ecosystems with man is increasingly smaller and smaller because of intensification of farmland. So that land use change and diversification into primarily human uses away from primarily natural uses are the biggest loss. But there are others. For example, the species which we directly use, particularly as food, but also as, for example, furniture, species of trees, are lost through overexploitation. More than half of all the species that we use, and considerably more than 50% in terms of, for example, marine fisheries, are overexploited, so that right now we are taking out of the population a higher proportion than it can annually replace through reproduction. So the stock, what we might call the natural capital of those species, is going down and down and down. So if our exploitation doesn't change, then those species will become commercially extinct, if not completely extinct. We're also eliminating species which are not of use to us, but we believe are in competition with us. So if you take the example of wolves in Europe and in the USA, they're believed to be a direct danger to humans and danger to farm animals. Now, most of that belief is unrealistic. It's caused by children's stories like Little Red Riding Hood. It's not real. The number of wolves that kill sheep is very, very small. And wolves in some countries are now being reintroduced and can happily coexist with farming, providing there's some means of compensating farmers for their losses, which are, as I said, small. But nevertheless, species that are believed to be in competition with man have been brought down to very, very low levels or eliminated in countries. So Britain, for example, has no wolves, which it used to have. It has no bears, which it used to have. Then another cause of biodiversity loss is the spread of alien species. Alien species, on the one hand, have been deliberately introduced around the world because of a perceived benefit, which went with a lack of understanding of the disbenefits. So rabbits were introduced to Australia by early European settlers, but they've been causing havoc in the grasslands which otherwise were wanted for sheep rearing. Species like crayfish have been introduced in Europe from America, and in the Mediterranean and in Africa from America, different species, because they're good to eat. But they've caused havoc because they have spread naturally outside their cultivated ponds and disrupted the natural ecosystems. Many plants introduced from South America or from the Himalayas, because of their beauty, have caused havoc and decline of native biodiversity when they have spread outside their cultivated area. And if you are also doing the course Globalization, there's a very good film which illustrates globalization, but it also illustrates biodiversity loss through the spread of alien species. So I would draw your attention to that. Now, before you started this course, if someone had asked you what is the biggest threat to biodiversity loss, I bet many of you would have said climate change, because climate change is in the news as an environmental issue, perhaps of the greatest importance. But I, as a scientist, would question that. Climate change is certainly an issue which is going to become more and more important in the future. And it's an issue which is important for humans in certain parts of the world at the moment. But it's not as important an issue for biodiversity loss as land use change has been. It's just going to make all the other causes of biodiversity loss worse. So climate change is certainly included, but it's not the most important. And now we're coming to the final part of this introductory lecture. What can be done about biodiversity loss? And I want to look at that in two ways. The first way is to look at the scales on which action is being taken. And the second is to look at the methods. Now obviously we look at the scales first because the methods can be applied to any scales. But if we start with ourselves, with a person who wants to do something to help stem biodiversity loss. Now he or she can volunteer in a local nature reserve or nature park to help the management of that area. That management is likely to be driven by either a national or a subnational, like in the United Kingdom, a county organisation, which might be a statutory or a voluntary organisation. So in the United Kingdom, for example, wildlife trusts are voluntary organisations at county level, and they manage protected areas, nature reserves, and they may have a national status as well. But members of those wildlife trusts, or even non-members, can volunteer to help manage them, because management of biodiversity is often to do with stopping succession of vegetation to a climax which is less rich in species than the different stages, earlier stages of succession. So at that local level, an individual level, this is what we can all do. Now, then we go up in scale to a national or a subnational level, and what goes on is usually guided by policies which are either enshrined in laws or in guidance. What are called in the British Isles, they'd be called guidance notes or white papers. And those control what counties or cities might do, or what is legal and what is not legal in terms of wildlife protection. If we go higher still, then in Europe we have a regional level, that is to say the European Community. And that regional level imposes what are called directives on the member states. So in the United Kingdom, a lot of conservation policy may be enshrined in English law or Scottish law or Welsh law, but it is imposed by European directives. Perhaps the most valuable is the Habitats which defines habitats which must be conserved. And if any representative of those habitats is damaged by development activities, then the government is obliged to restore or recreate that habitat somewhere else. And then at the highest level we have international action. Now, international action is either enshrined in activities of the United Nations, which tries to bring on countries voluntarily to United Nations initiatives, or by international conventions which countries directly sign up to. They may be started by the UN, but they are driven by the secretariat which is created by the convention itself. So an important biodiversity conservation convention is called the Ramsar Convention, which is for the protection and restoration of wetlands. It's called Ramsar because that's the name of a town in Iran where the convention was initially held, but the countries which signed up to it support financially a secretariat which is based in Switzerland called the Ramsar Secretariat, which is responsible. It's only a small group, a few people, maybe 15 people, but that secretariat is responsible for how the convention is applied through communicating with countries. And most importantly, conventions have what are called conventions of the parties, or COPs, which meet every 2 or 3 years to look at the way the convention is being managed. So that's the highest level at which we can try and improve biodiversity. And of course the major convention is called the Biodiversity Convention, or correctly the Convention on Biological Diversity, known as the Rio Convention because it was held in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. So those are the scales, really 4 scales: individual, national, regional, if there is one, between the country, and international. And then the methods of biodiversity convention. Now, the main method that has been operating for at the longest 100 years or so is the designation by countries of protected areas. Now, I said earlier that those protected areas increased dramatically in number after the Second World War and generated a tourist industry. But in America, for example, in the US, protected areas were declared more than 100 years ago, if you think of a well-known one like Yellowstone National Park, and there has been tourism, at least internal tourism, to that protected area for as long as it's been declared. But every country in the world now has national parks, and at a lower level many countries have reserves which may be locally administered, or even lower level in Britain, for example, the smallest level of local government, called the parish, may have areas set aside as small areas of wildlife conservation, like for example, churchyards, which may be managed not to keep the grass very, very carefully mown like a billiard table, but grass which is managed for the benefit of flowers and butterflies. And still it serves its main purpose as an area for consecrated ground for buried souls. But if we go up to the next method, the next most common method of biodiversity conservation, it is legislation which restricts human activities. Now that might be individual humans or it might be corporations, but it restricts their activities in terms of either protected species or protected habitats. And that again is widespread throughout almost every nation in the world. And I mentioned also that many countries like the United Kingdom are driven in terms of biodiversity conservation by a combination of legislation which controls what people can and can't do, and also what can loosely be called policy guidance, which controls the way in which local authorities or city councils can or should behave. It's a guidance rather than a legislation which tells them what they must do. It tells them what they should do. The next method, which is very widespread, is education. And education, on the one hand, is statutory, but on the other hand, there are a large number of voluntary conservation bodies which contribute to the statutory education by either providing materials like booklets or films, or by bringing children out into protected areas or into wildlife walks in the wider countryside. And those voluntary bodies that largely engage in that kind of activity are also responsible for campaigning. And they are particularly important in terms of changing public opinion, and public opinion then changes government policy, slowly but surely. Now, it's important to distinguish two kinds of voluntary body, because there are those whose task is direct political campaigning, and they tend to do nothing else. International organisations like Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, Sea Shepherd and many others are direct campaign organisations, and in addition to campaigning they may take active roles in trying to prevent what they see as illegal activity, or activity which is maybe quasi-legal like Japanese whaling, but is ethically very, very dubious. And those are one kind of voluntary bodies, and other voluntary bodies which don't have direct political action, such as the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, the Wildlife Trusts in the United Kingdom. The RSPB has an international organisation which it formed called BirdLife International, which has, in most countries of the world, has a national agency which links with the international, with BirdLife. Now, they campaign but are not overtly political, so they campaign for biodiversity and they target all political parties rather than just one. So those are the methods, and as I said earlier on, they apply at different levels, at different scales as well. Now this module has my introductory lecture plus a small number of activities which you engage in over a total time of about 2 hours. So we've got the support material for this lecture, which are 2 short films I want you to look at, and those 2 films illustrate natural biodiversity, but they illustrate 2 different aspects of it. One of them illustrates an area that is biodiversity valuable, but actually very species poor, because it is an East African soda lake, which is an extreme environment, and so ecologically it has very few species living in that environment. But you will see when you watch the film that it's got high biodiversity value because of one species in that environment. The other is an environment not very far away, which is biodiversity of high biodiversity value because it is rich in mammal species. So those are at two extremes of both high biodiversity value, but one species poor and the other species rich. And then we've got two activities which we want you to engage in. The first one is to discuss local action for biodiversity conservation where you are, in the country, in the area of that country where you live. And there is some guidance on the web. And the second one is for you to discuss the international initiatives for biodiversity conservation. I've only mentioned two. I've mentioned the Ramsar Convention and I've mentioned the Biodiversity Convention, but there are several others which I want you to read about and to discuss whether they are working or not, particularly if you trace what has happened with the biodiversity conservation since 1992 to the present day. You will see that there are issues of whether it's been working or whether it hasn't. And if you trace also the United Nations initiatives, especially since the turn of the century. So thank you for watching this lecture. I hope you enjoy the rest of the module.